Good morning and welcome everyone to the 18th meeting of the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee and our 9th remote meeting. We also have apologies today from Ross Greer MSP, however I'm pleased to welcome Patrick Harvey MSP to the committee as a substitute member for Ross today. I'm also pleased to welcome Dean Lockhart MSP to the committee. Dean has replaced Gordon Lyndhurst MSP. I would like to thank Gordon for his contribution to the work of this committee and to wish him well as he rejoins the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee. Our first agenda item is a declaration of interests. Can I invite Dean Lockhart to make a declaration of any registrable interests that are relevant to the work of this committee? Dean.
Thank you very much, Convener. It's great to be back on the committee. In terms of relevant interests, I'm a member of the Law Society of England and Wales. Otherwise, I have no other interests to declare. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean. The next agenda item is a decision on taking agenda item 5 on draft correspondence on COVID-19 and tourism in private. Are we all agreed? We're all agreed, so we can now move on. Our first agenda item is evidence on the impact of COVID-19 on Scotland's cultural sector. Can I welcome Julia Amour, Director of Festivals Edinburgh, Nick Stewart from the Music Venues Alliance, he is the Coordinator for Scotland, the Music Venue Trust, Alec McGowan, Executive Director of the Citizens Theatre, and Lucy Cassock, Chief Executive Officer of Museums and Galleries Scotland, and Sandy Sweetman, Director of South West Audio Limited, to the meeting. I would remind members to give broadcasting staff a few seconds to operate your microphones before beginning to ask your questions or to provide an answer, and I would be grateful if questions and answers could be kept as succinct as possible. As we have a larger than usual panel for the format of this meeting, I would be grateful if members could indicate which of the panel their question is directed to. I will begin with the first question and then I will be followed by Claire Baker, and I shall bring each member in turn. Although I did say that we should direct questions to individual members of the panel, my opening question is directed to all members of the panel. I think most people have an understanding of how devastating the pandemic has been for the cultural and heritage sectors. So I wanted to ask you what your experience has been of the financial assistance you have received from the government, particularly in terms of starting up again. And if you could maybe talk about specifically about your own sector, what assistance has worked well for you, what is not working, and what would you like to change? And if I could bring Julia in first.
Okay. Hello, everyone can hear me now, I hope.
Yes.
Yes. So from Festivals Edinburgh's point of view, obviously we sit at the intersection of a huge range of interdependencies in the system. So individual artists, freelance producers, venues, commercial companies who are presenting work, and so on and so forth. So there's just a huge range of the schemes that some people have been able to draw on, but also really important gaps that have left other people, particularly, I guess, individuals in freelance positions who maybe have a mixed economy of work, which, as we know, is very common in this sector, who have perhaps a slightly less than half-time position with one of the venues, for example, or with a performing company, but make the rest of their work, their income through freelance work. They fall between the stools in terms of being able to apply for the self-employed grant or the furlough assistance. And that's a great worry to a lot of us in the system, because we can't function without that pipeline working really well. Obviously, you've had evidence from the independent venues who present, for example, at the Fringe, and again, they are in a difficult position in terms of not being eligible for some of the schemes that have so far run. There has been a good take-up by some of the Pivotal Enterprise Resilience Fund, And then because of the breadth of the sector and the communities that it faces, we've also had some of our festivals, like the Children's Festival, be awarded funds from the Third Sector Resilience Fund. So where people have been able to connect into that, it's fantastic. There are these gaps. These gaps are being talked about. I know I've talked about them in groups at national level, and of course we wait to hear how the Scottish Government is going to be making decisions about allocating the funding that has come through in consequentials from the UK Cultural Resilience Package. So it would be great to see those gaps addressed.
Okay, thanks very much. I'll bring in Alec McGowan now.
Thanks, convener. I think in terms of the three parts of your question, what's working, I think the single biggest help has been the JRS out of Treasury has made a big difference to organisations where we've had to close our buildings down, not be able to put on performances. So having some support for staff and to take advantage of a furlough scheme has materially contributed to our ability to remain a going concern this year and to see out the current financial year. I think alongside that, the Performing Arts Venue Relief Fund, which came in relatively recently, has been helpful for a lot of us in terms of just making sure we can see our way through to the end of the current financial year. With many organisations going through their audit processes at the moment, the going concern status of organisations has been a key part of that. So that's been helpful. And our existing funding commitments being committed to by Creative Scotland, amongst others, is at the very start of the pandemic, when we very swiftly found ourselves being told not to open, saying that our funding for the current year was going to flow through as anticipated, despite the fact we couldn't deliver any work, was also very important as well. And although not technically government, it was heartening to see a lot of the trusts and foundations that support a lot of our work were very quickly in touch with us to say that their funds for our programs that we deliver through their restricted funds, that those funds were still committed. In some cases, they were happy for us to unrestrict those funds and to use them in whatever way we felt was most appropriate to survive. So there's been a combination of things that very swiftly came out in the first few months of this that made it possible for us to see a way through to the end of the current year. I think what's not working, and it's a common theme, is that with JRS ending at the end of October, and with no sight yet when social distancing may no longer be a requirement, and that materially affects the financial viability of our companies, it's hard to figure out beyond this calendar year, let's say, how we keep going whilst we can't necessarily return to the capacity of operations we would expect. So I think that's important. I appreciate through a vagary of our funding, our local authority funding through Glasgow City Council is actually only confirmed until the end of September at present. Now, they were mid-process of changing their approach to funding, so we've got a bit of material uncertainty there until Glasgow City Council can confirm what their funding arrangements for the citizens will be. I'm not sure what's happening in other local authority areas about local authority funding. And I think looking ahead to what might change is the funding commitments for 2021. It's hard for us to predict when we all might be able to reopen fully, when audiences will be ready to return and in pre-COVID levels. So knowing that the revenue support will continue in 2021 is vital, and at what level. And I've talked about the JRS, but for a lot of the freelancers and self-employed people who make up a majority of our industry, the SACE scheme hasn't been as successful for some of them as it might have been, and also some self-employed people have just not been able to access the schemes because of their self-employed status. So I think there's some work to be done there to support the people in our industry who we see on our stages, who help make scenery, who technically run shows, and I think that's important as well.
Thanks very much. Can I just ask you, what percentage of your funding comes from Glasgow City Council?
Currently it's £290,000 a year, and we get 1.1 million a year from Creative Scotland.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but I take it, you know, the 200,000 is pretty essential.
Yes, all local authority funding is, and as you may be aware, Convener, we're in a slightly weird situation that sits right now. We're slightly in exile because the building's being redeveloped, so we're not actually in it. So the council are also major funders of the redevelopment of the Citizens Theatre as well.
Okay, thanks very much. We'll now move on to Nick Stewart from the Music Venue Trust.
Hi, John. So grassroots music venues have managed to get some initial stability from the rateable value related grants, and that may have avoided some immediate permanent closures. To date, no grassroots music venues in Scotland of the 80 in the Music Venues Alliance network have shut yet, but that may be about to change very soon. Most venues have had little other support other than their either £10,000 or £25,000 that they got from the rateable value supports. The furlough scheme has helped a lot of businesses, for sure, but essentially the core business that must exist, the bricks and mortar, with having the staff, isn't helped by the JRS scheme. So yes, it's important for us in terms of our infrastructure to be able to keep the staff that we have, but materially for the continuing whether or not the business can carry on, having the staff there is something where they may have become unemployed and could later be re-employed, but the business at core, staff other than the management, bookers, etc., it's slightly further down the list. The Pivotal and Creative Hospitality and Tourism funds were very difficult for grassroots music venues to access, and I think that we got very low numbers from those, unfortunately, although the Fiona Hislop had said that grassroots music venues would be pivotal enterprises. So it was a real shame not to get that. I think that of those who applied, only 12% were successful, and I tried to get the entire network to apply. Some venues have reopened as bars in order to try and get some kind of income, generally with poor results. Trade is between, I've heard as low as 25% is what they previously had, up to, I think, 60% was the best I'd heard from anyone. And all of that trade is rapidly diminishing with the music ban that has been brought in temporarily. At least we hope it's temporary. We understand the Scottish Government is looking at that and what they can do about it. I could talk at this point about the forthcoming £2.2 million fund for grassroots music venues, but I think it may be pertinent to leave that to slightly later and not take up too much time at the start.
Okay. Right, thanks very much. I'd now like to go to Sandy Sweetman. I mean, we received a lot of evidence from people who were in the supply chain and supplying technical services to the arts. And we can't obviously invite them all to the committee, but it's really good to have Sandy here to represent that sector and to talk directly about how it affects his business.
Thanks, Convener. So being a business owner, we rely a lot on the freelancers on a variable scale of how many we need for each job. Personal, but we did okay with having the rateable value business grant, and that came in quickly. That covered that the initial kind of costs for me, and then through appeal, we were successful in getting some of the Pivotal Enterprise Resilient Fund. So that was successful. However, personally, as a director of a small company, the furlough is based on PAYE. We take a very low PAYE and then take as much as we need out of the business and reinvest a lot into equipment just to keep up to date with things. So the furlough scheme didn't really work for me personally. And I know a lot of the people that work for me are freelancers. A lot of them are very young and haven't got 3 years worth of accounts that make a huge difference. So they're struggling, really struggling with although the concept of application was good, it didn't tick all the boxes. So a lot of people were left out there. The worry we've got ongoing is the confidence doesn't seem to be there, and I know your other witnesses there were saying as well. It's just the worry of we rely on the confidence coming from the venues and the events. I'm just not seeing it going into winter, that there's much going to be happening at all. We also service the local theatre as the incumbent technicians.
support for you going forward?
So the support I've had kind of seals the fact that I can survive at a level. Our overheads are quite low, but going forward at the moment, it doesn't look like there's much in the way of support after the furlough scheme. It doesn't really work for me personally, so I can't comment on behalf of other people. But as soon as those disappear, there's nothing really left. There is the announcement of the support for the services sector, which opens up on Monday. However, one of the remits for that is if you've had any previous support, you can't apply for it. So that takes, that I'm not able to then apply for support to that. If I could, as a business owner who supplies freelancers, I would have applied for it, but to pass on a percentage to the freelancers to help them as well. But I don't have that opportunity.
Okay, is that the funding for the events sector that you're referring to?
There's a funding open up on Monday. I'm sorry, I don't know the actual name of the fund, but it's for service providers to the events sector.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much for that. That is very interesting and very worrying. I'll now come to Lucy Castle, the Chief Executive Officer of Museums and Galleries Scotland, and you're obviously from the heritage sector, which is different again, Lucy. What's working for you and what would you like to see improved?
Yes, thanks. So Museums and Galleries Scotland, we represent 419 museums and galleries across Scotland, and they're hugely diverse in their governance and in their scale. About a quarter of them are volunteer-run themselves, and it goes right up to the big national institutions. So they've been able to access a sort of wide variety of different sources of funding, and with varying degrees of success depending on let's say their governance structure. The job retention scheme has been vital for a lot of them, and obviously there's some concern with that coming to an end. The Third Sector Resilience Fund has been key to others. Few access the Pivotal Fund, a few the Tourism Hardship Fund, and a number received funding through the National Lottery Heritage Fund. But we are also a funder ourselves, so we received some additional funding from the Scottish Government right at the beginning, which was £400,000 of an urgent response fund. So we were able to support some of the recognised collections, and they accredited the museums with recognised and important collections, but only with 12 weeks worth of funding. So that staved off some immediate crisis for some. We've also run two small funds. One is a digital support fund to try and help people to get working from home. So digital was in it to buy the equipment and the licenses they needed to be able to continue to function working away from their normal venues. And we're currently running a COVID adaptation fund, which is helping venues to make the changes that they need, if that's screens and PPE and contactless donation points and such like technology to help them to make the changes that are needed to enable them to open safely. And the last fund, we're very pleased to have received £4 million from that £97 million culture fund to support create a recovery and resilience fund. And that's for the independent museum sector. So about 50%, just over 50% of the museum sector are independent charities, and they're the ones that have been most immediately placed at the greatest risk because they don't have any core funding. So we will be able to support them with costs through to March, and that fund is open now, and we're working hard to try and make sure that everyone understands what that opportunity is. What our concerns are about the other half of the sector. So about more than 35% of the museums are civic museums, either run directly by local authorities or run by the Culture and Leisure Trusts, with a few more in the Culture and Leisure Trust side of that. And they face some real challenges at the moment, which at the moment we're working hard to try and find a solution for those, but we haven't quite got there yet. Also university museums, which is 23 in Scotland, again, because as they're not a core, can be perceived as not being core to the function of a university, they're at risk as well. And I think for all of the museums sector, the concern is what happens beyond March, and obviously that's true for everybody. This isn't going to suddenly recover come the 1st of April next year, and although we're seeing costs through to March, it's important that we start to think about those longer term challenges, and that's one of the things we're doing for those we are funding through the independent museums fund is to encourage within that fund museums to look at what they might need to do to be more resilient going forward, and we'll be working hard with them over the months to come to look at that. So those are the two challenges we have, is really the half of the sector that's not catered for and beyond March.
Thank you very much for that. And Lucy, listening to you there has reminded me that I should perhaps have drawn attention to my declaration of members' interest in that I'm the chair of a small voluntary museum which has accessed funds from Museum and Galleries Scotland. So thank you for that. Okay, I shall now pass on to Claire Baker, the Deputy Convener.
Thank you very much, Convener. If I just maybe go back to the issue of funding, and while panellists have outlined and they've had available and the value that has been, if they could give the MSPs an impression of how long you expect this funding to last. Obviously, the consequentials was announced at the start of July, and we haven't had full awarding of the consequentials yet. I understand there's some 73 million still to be awarded, but that does have to be spent within the financial year. And a lot of organisations are, if they do receive funding, having to deal with outstanding debts and bills that have been there since March. So the funding, how long do you think the funding will last, and how long feel the support that has been awarded will enable the organisations to survive? And I thought it might be helpful for maybe Alex and Lucy and Julia maybe to give a, I know we have quite a big panel, so maybe start with those panellists.
Who would like to go first? Julia?
Sure. Yeah, there is an absolute immediate need out there, and I guess Alex is probably best, well, and Lucy, it's not my sector, but they're best placed to talk about that in terms of the institutions that have ongoing monthly fixed costs, which is causing them to experience a cliff edge, in the near future. Let alone the independent sector for music venues, for example, that Nick represents. I think that it is a tricky balance that everybody has to strike between making sure that we serve as much of that immediate need as possible, and also think about what the longer term shape of the sector is going to be, and think about how we create a pipeline of creative content and production and participation to make sure that we've got a sort of core of cultural strength intact when the sector tries to help society to emerge from this crisis in 21-22. What we've been advocating for is a kind of quite an open approach to allocating those funds, rather than small pots dedicated to specific purposes, so that when people can make their application and make their case to what part they play in that system, there can be a kind of portfolio decision making about how the funds, which are not going to be enough to save every job or every organisation, are used. And I like the fact that we are talking about using some of those funds for freelancers and for supply chain, as well as using them for the institutions that connect artists with audiences. Obviously, as festivals, we would argue that we have a very vital role in society coming back out of this and creativity coming back out of this, because if we miss out any part of that system, then we don't have a coherent system going forward. But I think that it's vital that we look at the system as a whole and don't just think about one part of it in isolation, because we're all interdependent.
I would have Lucy and Alex, we want to add a short comment on how long the funding that has been awarded, because both have received funding so far, how long the expectation is that can last.
Thanks. Specifically in terms of the Citizens Theatre, the funding commitments we've got will last us till the end of the current financial year, so 31st of March 2021. And that's a combination of our Creative Scotland revenue funding for the year, assuming Glasgow Council extend their revenue funding at the same level beyond the end of September, the Performing Arts Venue Relief Fund that we obtained £100,000 from, and we estimate we'll have drawn down approximately £300,000 from the JRS scheme. So in total, that's £1.8 million across those funds to survive this financial year with no income. In any normal year, our revenue funding is about £1.4 million. So if we look forward beyond from April 21 onwards, if we're still massively restricted on our revenue generation capacity, then the funding commitments we have in principle for 21-22 will be insufficient to sustain the organisation in its current form.
So just to add to that from the museum side of things, I think one of the things that's really important to recognise is that a lot of museums are in a very precarious position before this started, and that's that we've done a piece of work with Vocal, looking particularly at the Civic Museum sector and this position they were in after many years of cuts, and with future cuts already scheduled to happen before COVID. There's real concern there as to whether we actually need some different funding models going forward. So there's a lot of talk around that at the moment, and of course we're trying to deal at the moment with the challenges of this year, but we don't want to leave it too late into this year to be thinking about the challenges beyond that. And so for all parts of the sector, really, first of all, getting to March, but beyond that is looking like a concern. And I think one of the things, I absolutely agree with Julia, that we need to think creatively as a sector. We need to think across some of the boundaries that we've traditionally worked within, or the silos we've traditionally worked within. But you can only do that creative thinking. It's very hard to do that when your back's against the wall. So this year's funding is really, really important to create that space. But we then need to use that space to think creatively for the future.
Okay, thank you. If I could ask Nick a question about the forthcoming guidance for indoor music performances. We do have guidance for outdoor music performances and the indicative date of the 14th for indoor music performances. What would the sector like to see in the guidance? And does he have, we did raise the issue of the ban on background music. I have to say I struggle to see how at the moment you can't have background music when the 14th of September you're imagined to have a band playing inside a venue. I don't know how those two things match up, but does he want to say a bit about what you need to see in the guidance to make performances viable?
Hi Claire, I was looking at the guidance from quite early stages, and I'm afraid that it's been through enough revisions. I think the final version that's produced was the 10th, that I'm struggling to see the difference between the earlier and later version, so I have a little confusion in my head exactly about what it'll be, but I do agree with the contradiction that you can't have a music ban and at the same time have venues opening for socially distanced performances on the 14th of September. I will point out the most grassroots music venues, one physically cannot host socially distant performances. Sneaky Pete's, for instance, if you were to do a show, would have a capacity of 12 instead of a capacity of 100, and that would include performers and staff. So it's very tricky for us to do it. But secondly, on a financial level, it would be extremely difficult to try and run those shows. The shows would certainly not be profitable unless there was very significant funding coming from somewhere else. And for a venue like Sneaky Pete's that normally hosts, well, between gigs and clubs, somewhere in the region of 650 shows a year, the amount of funding that you would need per show to plough into a venue to allow some of that stuff to happen would be very tricky. I hope you don't mind me jumping back for a wee second in that you were asking about how long funding will last for. It's very particular for grassroots music venues that funding is not designed to get us through to the 31st of March. Our £2.2 million fund, which is now open for applications, is intended to get venues through to the 31st of October. Thereafter, there is no further funding in place. And this is a really crucial and really tricky area for us. You have a report from Ian Munro saying that £74 million worth of Creative Scotland money is yet to be allocated. But we have it from Creative Industries when we're asking about what their thoughts on a follow-on fund are, that the £97 million is essentially already allocated and that half of it has gone to heritage in the first place. So in an environment where we don't know what's actually happening with that money, it's a little tricky. Our advice from Creative Industries said they will have to look elsewhere in the Scottish Government budget to try and fund any future work that will go on in grassroots music venues. So it's a very tricky situation there. About any follow-on, the best that we have is that our thinking, this is a quote, our thinking about what comes next is still happening. Ms. Hislop had talked about having something, this is months ago, talked about having some kind of follow-on that would be innovative and ambitious, and potentially that could have been around the idea of having support for doing socially distanced shows. We pointed out at that stage, exactly what I've said to you now, that it's very difficult for us to do them, especially in the smaller venues, and that it's not financially viable to do so. So if it was support for that, and I think there was some discussion around the time where a lot of people believed that streaming might have been able to plug up some of the funding gaps, or even that venues would be giving funding to go and do festivals outdoors, etc. But really, the £2.2 million was decided because it was the exact fixed costs for the 80 grassroots music venues in Scotland to get through 3 months. The fixed costs being non-furloughable staff and paying for their rent, insurance, any hire purchase payments, that sort of thing as well. So once we get to the 31st of October, we're at an absolute cliff edge with no plan about what's going to happen next. And really specifically, that is when JRS ends as well. So it would be foolhardy for most businesses to try and continue at that point, and we urgently need some kind of information about what kind of future funding we can get to keep us going. We know very well from UK government that they will not fund any future JRS, although I understand Ms. Sturgeon's asked for that again recently. So then there must be a plan, or we're going to see mass closures. At the moment, we already have a situation where the funding which is intended to get grassroots music venues through to the end of October won't actually be received by venues until at the earliest end of September, and for most we're thinking early October. Of the network of 80 venues, 10 of them have come to Music Venue Trust's emergency fund, which we've set up, which has been crowdfunded, because they will have to permanently close if they don't receive immediate funds before that time. So Music Venue Trust itself is trying to help out in the absence of Creative Scotland being able to give out money on time for those venues.
Thank you. I went to visit PG Malloy's this week, and they're in the situation that Nick has described, so that's thanks for your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to bring in Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Convener. The evidence that we've heard thus far has been extremely helpful, and I'd like to thank the contributors. I'd like to ask a question just regarding the furlough scheme. Clearly, from what we've heard, it seems to have benefited, but also not so. So would the panel think that the furlough scheme itself should actually be continued? Bearing in mind last week, the German government announced that their furlough scheme is going to be extended for a further 24 months. If anyone wants to come in first. Go, Alex. Alex McGowan.
Hi.
You want to come in first?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it should be extended. As several of us have alluded to already, social distancing in any form whilst necessary and understandable, is incompatible financially with the businesses that we run. And for as long as that social distancing is in place, we will find it hard to retain the organisations that we operate. And even beyond the end of social distancing, let's imagine it disappears, pick a date out there, let's say April, new financial year. It's going to take quite some time for audiences to have the confidence to return to venues, to galleries, to museums. The recent research undertaken in the theatre sector amongst audiences across the UK is indicating that I think it was about 17% of audiences are comfortable attending as soon as venues reopen, and that's even if social distancing is part of it. 50% of audiences will only consider attending if it appears that social distancing and hygiene measures in each venue are actually working. And 33% of audiences are saying that they'll wait until they can attend when there's no social distancing and a vaccine or treatment's already in place. So that gives a sense of how long this is going to take for recovery. So the JRS would be vital for that for a number of organisations. But it's not just the JRS, because, again, as some of us alluded to, that helps permanent employees within organisations, but that doesn't directly help 60–70% of the people that make up the theatre sector's workforce in Scotland. So other schemes akin to that need to be found to support them as well. Otherwise, we'll be decimated as an industry.
Okay. Nick?
Just agree that it would be very useful for sure, and that also self-employment schemes would be very useful to get going as well. It would be great to prioritise getting venues reopened, but venues all seem to agree that the real priority is protecting public health. We've continued to do whatever we can in that area, and so continued support in some form to allow us to do that would be great. Music Venue Trust's slogan around this has been that we want to reopen every venue safely. So that's quite important. If you get to the point where socially distanced shows are allowed to happen, and then JRS has ended, then venues will go, well, we have to try and do shows. And that'll actually be the crunch point for a lot of venues, because they will try to trade. And as we've seen from those who've opened as bars, they will probably do so unsuccessfully. And that could be the unraveling of the organisation.
Julia?
We've been working with DCMS and Westminster politicians about this very issue, and if the Chancellor is absolutely adamant that JRS is not to continue, we think a sector-specific approach to those sectors that will be the last to open is critical, and that it could be turned into a subsidy for people to be working rather than not to be working. If that's a key problem for conceptually for the UK government. I think the previous speakers are absolutely right that as long as the social distancing remains, then there is going to be a serious problem making those venues viable. We are also talking repeatedly about why we are not on the same footing as hospitality with 1 metre plus. That's not necessarily to say that that would be viable, but it would be more viable than 2 metres. So I think there's a discussion that needs to be had there as well. But in the meantime, if venues are not able to operate on a viable basis, then at least we retain the skills and we retain the ability to actually reinvent and reimagine some of our cultural content into other contexts if organisations like Alex's would be able to be supported to have staff working rather than not working.
Okay. Lucy?
Yes, I think it's important also to recognise that just being allowed to open doesn't mean that venues can. So museums and galleries could open on the 15th of July, and I think a handful did that first week. 6 weeks in, we've got 113 museums and galleries open, so that's still less, it's about a quarter of the sector that has been able to open. So the permission to do so doesn't make it viable necessarily for everyone. And there are more who are intending to open, but we're obviously already getting towards the end of the peak season. So for many, they just simply will not open this year, and therefore we'll face those ongoing challenges. Gordon Morrison of ASFA helpfully, they've got a survey out at the moment to get some information back from those who are open as what the experience has been, and that survey is ongoing. So it's some interim results you shared with me yesterday. There's only 30% of those who are open are consider themselves to be operating sustainably. So venues are opening with higher costs because of the need for potentially additional staff, additional cleaning and so on, but with much reduced capacity, much reduced income. So that's obviously not only 30% can trade sustainably. That doesn't necessarily encourage everybody else to do the same. So ongoing support will be needed.
Okay. And Sandy?
Just to reflect on what the previous speaker has said, so our diary is basically cleared, which affects all our freelance workers as well, and that's till the earliest of next spring. So the JRS is really important for these people, but I think it needs to be more specifically tailored to the kind of the last to reopen, such as the cultural side of things. So I think absolutely essential, but it needs to be adapted to meet the needs of very specifically.
Okay, thank you. My second and final question is that you've part answered it. Just it's in terms of the schemes that have been put in place thus far by both the Scottish and UK governments. Clearly there has been assistance there, and you've all indicated that. But there are challenges there too, and there are clearly some gaps with funding that is there. Do you think that with the schemes that have been presented, do you think that the gaps that have actually are going to provide a long-term scarring to the sectors that you're involved in, by way of potentially more closures, more people being made redundant, and less of a cultural offer in the sectors that you provide. And can we start with Julia first this time?
Sadly, yes. I think it's very difficult to see a future in which there isn't a loss coming out of the end of this process. If I think about the events supply chain, for example, Sandy's been talking about it. 70% of the suppliers to Edinburgh's festivals, we did a survey of this a couple of months ago, are SMEs, and in some cases there are only, because we're a small country and we've developed this amazing capability of being able to put on major festivals and events, and in some cases there are maybe only 1 or 2 suppliers in the country who've got the capability to do things like rigging of massive great outdoor arenas and sets and things like that. And I know from the forums that I'm sitting in that a lot of them are counting the amount of cash flow they've got in weeks rather than months. So we've rehearsed some of the other issues around freelancers. Great number are having to find work in other sectors to sustain themselves, and whether they will be able to go back to creative practice, I think, depends on the long-term response as well as the short-term response. So I wish I could say otherwise, but I do think that there will be scarring. I think that the best way that we can minimise that damage is to take this overview of what does the kind of creative pipeline look like over the next 2 years and the next 3 years, and what roles do we all play in that?
Okay, thank you, Sandy.
Any loss is going to hit us at the end of the supply chain. And as Julia mentioned there's a lot of freelancers already that we use who have turned to other jobs, other careers, and in our area, we're being rural, we haven't got a huge number of people to rely on. And if we lose the people we do have, then we're going to struggle to support the work we hope to get. It's a knock-on effect as much as the immediate effect of the losses.
Thank you. Nick?
I haven't got a great deal to add there. Quite well said, except that to say that any venues that are permanently closed, and that permanent scarring, as you describe it, are very unlikely to be reopened by someone else. It was already the case the grassroots music venues were closing all across the UK. As it happened, 2019 was a turnaround year, because while live music is wildly popular, it's just very expensive and very difficult to run a grassroots music venue. Given local licensing conditions, property values, etc., it's very rare that people open a new grassroots music venue at the moment, and it seems very unlikely that we would have venues that close being subsequently reopened as new music venues. Most likely, a canny landlord would decide to turn the building into something else.
Okay. Lucy?
Thanks. I think that the funding that has been made available will greatly reduce the scarring that was a great threat at the beginning of this crisis, but there will still, I'm sure, definitely be some long-term impacts from that. The bit of the sector I'm most concerned about at the moment is the civic sector, and that's because as a non-statutory service, I think that's where there will be ongoing pressures for as there already were for a long time to come, and whether we need to look at potentially different models for how we make sure that those civic organisations that hold those collections on behalf of the public and make them available to the public, that closures there would be a real loss to society, to our communities. And I think, as Julie says, that there are a lot of specialist skills in the sector, and I think once you lose those skills, it's very difficult to bring them back. There's also, just as if you once lose a venue, they're very difficult to bring back, and for one organisation to fail doesn't necessarily mean that somebody else still has to care for that collection. It isn't necessarily cheaper for somebody else to look after it than the organisation that is already doing so. I do think that we also need to see what opportunities there are from the funding that is available this year, and clearly there's quite a bit of that funding that's still to be announced. But we need to take this opportunity between now and March to think about what more creative solutions that we might be able to come up with, how we can work more collaboratively, and sometimes a crisis forces some of those more creative solutions. It won't work for everybody, but I think that it's incumbent on those of us, certainly in the sector bodies such as my own, to try and support the sector as best we can to look for those and look across what taking more of a place-based approach to cultural activity in an area, and whether there's opportunities for things like shared services or shared use of venues and things. So, but that takes some facilitation and things to do, and some support that needs to come in behind that. But we will be working very hard to try and make the very best use of the opportunity we've been given, and to support the part of the sector, the independent sector in particular.
Thank you. And finally, Alex.
Just to echo what the others have said, it's hard to imagine there won't be some long-term scarring as a result of this. If one just the macroeconomic impacts of the pandemic will create a trading environment that could be challenging in terms of revenue generation, fundraising, things like that. And we, in terms of venues, producing venues, if I just think about what used to be called the foundation organisations, which were the 5 main producing theatres in Scotland, have been in receipt of the same level of revenue funding since 2006. Now, we've sustained our organisations in that period on standstill funding by increasing revenue generation. So that's how we've survived, but it's made us less resilient. So if I look ahead to where that revenue generation has been compromised, and the revenue funding is stagnant, we've seen a period denuding of the theatre production in Scotland. I think if you spoke to colleagues, perhaps actors or technicians and designers and writers, they would say that the work opportunities in Scotland have been declining over a period of time. And I think there were some issues pre-COVID, and I think COVID's exacerbated them.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Dean Lockhart next, but before I do, can I just say to both members and witnesses, if every member asks 2 questions of every single witness, then we're not going to get through all the members of the committee. So if members could perhaps indicate which witnesses that they want to answer the questions, and you know, if there is obviously repetition, you can just say that you agree with one another, but we're not going to be able to get through all the questions if we do it that way. So if you could just bear that in mind, thanks very much. Dean.
Thank you very much, Convener. Following your instructions, my question is directed towards Julie and Lucy, because they raised the issue of funding streams available, and also mentioned the fact that the Scottish Government has allocated, I think, only 25 million of the £100 million consequential funding available. I would like to get views on what might be causing delays to this funding becoming available, and once it is available, what would be the most impactful way that this funding could help the sector? Perhaps start with Julia first.
I guess that the lead time is about trying to make that balance that I was talking about between immediate, servicing immediate need, and also making a scheme which will look to the future and to adaptation and to renewal. And I don't envy people that job of trying to design a scheme for the distribution of £100 million in very short order. But I do agree with other witnesses that there is very immediate need out there, and that people need to be getting a sight line to some relief soon. Otherwise, people will start dropping out of the system. In terms of what it could best be used for, I think for the festivals in Edinburgh, we're conscious that in returning there's rightly a lot of expectation and responsibility on us to balance different kinds of benefits to the artists and the professionals, to the audiences, the wider communities, to the economy and to the environment. And I guess, as well as being able to make it possible for that extraordinary world-class cluster of festivals to still be there in 2021, I think that we would want to look at using any funds that we were able to access through that scheme to work out how we can play the best role in that recovery, connecting artists and audiences and markets, while also doing the best that we can with community resilience and recovery, and those networks that we'd started to develop through our Platforms for Creative Excellence programme, which was about renewing the festival's sense of kind of purpose and vision after the 70th anniversary in 2017. So I think that it's an unenviable task, but we need to have some visibility soon about what the shape of that scheme is going to look like, so that we can all play our part in still being here and contributing to that building back better.
Thank you. And Lucy?
Yes, well, we obviously one of the ones who've been fortunate enough to have an announcement of £4 million from that pot, and we were very grateful for that. And the reason I think that was it's for part of the sector, and we put in a request for funding for others as well, for the whole of the sector, but this was the part that was most urgently at risk, and that was why it was prioritised, so we were grateful for that. As Julie says, I think it's an unenviable task. There are so many competing demands for that funding. The part that we're still concerned about, as I've said already, is in relation to how we can support the museums and galleries, particularly run by the Culture and Leisure Trusts, those with the local authority museums and university museums. And I think the complexity there is around how the different governance models there, and how we would direct funding through to the civic sector. And there are lots of different ways that could be done, as to whether that's done as for culture as a whole, or whether it's done separately for museums, libraries, and so on. So I know there's very active discussions around that at the moment, and we hope to hear some news relatively soon. But there's lots of different ways that could be done, with pros and cons around all of them.
Thanks very much. Convener, my second question is about support in non-financial areas or non-financial support, because I think Nick mentioned the impact of planning and licensing, and I'd like to ask Nick, Alex and Sandy for their views on what non-financial support and changes might help the sector. For example, being much more flexible about planning and license changes and other operational changes that might help the sector. So perhaps start with you, Nick.
Well, it has been good news that the agent of change principle was introduced in Scottish planning, which will help to protect grassroots music venues in future. I think actually out with licensing planning, something that MVT is very keen for, and actually Creative Scotland are very keen for, is for further support for grassroots music venues through funding infrastructure in future, simply because we haven't had that relationship prior. And I understand you're talking about what it is that planning and licensing could do. Some of those issues around planning and licensing will simply remain. I think we've gotten to some extent a better point. That one of the main issues is noise, simply, and all that can be done for local licensing authorities to be mindful of the importance of the grassroots music venues in their areas would be good. Creative Scotland had struggled historically to be able to give money to grassroots music venues because they were spending lottery money, and a lot of the organisations are not set up as charities or CICs, etc. So when it came to any capital purchases, etc., because these organisations are typically limited companies or sole traders or limited liability partnerships, they didn't have an asset lock in place. If there is to be more money that is going to come from Scottish Government in some other way, if it comes directly from Scottish Government, then there isn't the asset lock issue. So I'd be very keen to see some more of those relationships happening. Just to jump back for 2 seconds, I'm sorry if I'm wavering away from your point. I've been told by Creative Industries that the £97 million has essentially been allocated. And I know that you have a report from Ian Munro saying that £74 million is still available and unallocated. I would invite MSPs to interrogate that and find out what is really going on, because we don't. And I also sit with the Scottish Commercial Music Industry Task Force, and they themselves are very confused about this. There's a new fund that's been announced by Event Scotland, which will not be coming from the £97 million as far as I know. So where's the money? Where's it going? I would invite you to interrogate it, especially since we've been told essentially that there is no more money for us unless something else is come up with.
Nick, thank you very much. That's a very good question. I think that's something this committee should look at indeed. Perhaps I could ask Alex and Sandy about either a financial question or support in non-financial areas. I'll leave it up to you. Which one do you think is the priority?
I'll come in.
Alex or Sandy, I think you've got your microphone, so go ahead, please.
Yeah. So for us, I can answer swiftly on both. The financial assistance is key for us. For non-financial, I think it's further up the supply chain, and it's given assistance and support maybe through guidance, health and safety guidance to the people that put on events, because people are scared to put on events because they don't understand a lot of the guidelines. So that then reflects on our work situation. So if there was non-financial, directly financial support to the event planners, because they're not all venues, a lot of our clients are communities and galas and things like that, and they just their initial reaction is just to cancel everything because they're scared, they don't understand the complexities of the guidelines. So that would assist us if there was any kind of support to go to these people who put on events to make sure they feel that events are going to be safe. So that's my concise answer there. Thanks.
Thanks very much. And Alex, I think I will come to you now.
Thanks. Echoing what Sandy just said, I think guidance around events being safe, there's been a lot of work being done across industry on setting up guidelines for audiences, performers, and such like, and I think that's been helpful. I think having something that can help reassure audiences on that front would be good, a sort of consistent standard across performances. There's also work to be done in the insurance sector. I know one of our industry bodies, UK Theatre, is currently doing a survey amongst us all about the challenges around insurance. As you may be aware, insurance didn't really help us in this pandemic. It didn't cover us for anything. And insuring against these kinds of losses going forward are probably unaffordable. But therefore, how do we mitigate the risks of wanting to put on live performances in an uncertain environment? I think that would be important to consider as well. And I would echo the point about the £97 million. My understanding is it's already been allocated, but there's no knowledge of how.
Thank you very much. Convener, I think that's my two questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dean. Patrick.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to our panel. I think you've all painted already quite a clear and strong picture of the challenges facing the sector, and I wonder if I could ask you to think about what we should be putting to the Scottish Government by way of proposals for the next steps they can take to support the sector. I'd like to ask first about places and then about people. In relation to places, one of the things that I struggle with is the incredible diversity of the venues and the places that we're talking about. You know, we're talking about organisations very large and small. Some will have their own premises, some won't. For some, those premises are an overhead and a cost. For others, they're a source of income by renting them out. Some will be using totally private sector commercial premises with commercial landlords that are either supportive or unsupportive. There'll be public sector venues. There'll be those run by alios, for example, where it's a leisure centre that's lost income, but that's going to pose a threat to the cultural venues that are run by the same organisation. So how can the Scottish Government and local government provide a coherent package of support when the circumstances and needs of the organisations are so varied and diverse? I suspect everybody could comment on this, so I'll just pick a couple of people at random. Perhaps Nick from the Music Venues Alliance, and then Julia from Festivals Edinburgh.
Well, I think that whereas we weren't having conversations with government or Creative Scotland, say 3 years ago, that's certainly been ramped up over the last few years, and in particular now. So I think one of the real benefits of this situation, if you're to pick one, is actually the opening up of dialogue and how we get continued relationships from this point forward. I think that even the organisations which should be expert on this, such as Creative Scotland, really weren't previously aware of the diversity of organisations that they were dealing with as venues, and the rest as well. So in answer to your question, really, it's just about continuing to have dialogues, and if it means that there are 2,000 different schemes to help all the different parts of the arts sector, then I don't have a problem with that. I think that's probably a good thing. It makes it quite difficult to allocate who should have what and the size of each piece, but because the work wasn't done before, it's happening now, it needs to be ongoing.
Yeah, I think the civil servants might face a challenge in running 2,000 different schemes, but the point is well made.
Yeah, and just to add to that, my understanding is that neither Creative Scotland nor anyone else is particularly keen to be given the task of allocating all of these £97 million funds, because they simply don't have the resources, and in terms of having to have conversations with different parts of the sector, they don't necessarily have experience. So it's quite an open play at the moment.
Sure. Could I ask Julia from Festivals Edinburgh to comment, because you'll obviously work with such an incredibly wide range of different organisations working in different circumstances and with different kinds of support needs that they could be looking at.
Absolutely. I would totally echo what Nick's been saying about talking together. I think, in particular, Scottish Government and local authorities talking together. I think Lucy has already alluded to the real concerns about where local authority finances are, and I think there have been some discussions between COSLA and Scottish Government about that. But as you say, a place-based approach to, what is threatened in terms of cultural infrastructure in its broadest sense in local authorities is critical. So in a way, paradoxically, what I'm saying is you need a localist approach, but also, I think, a blanket approach. So I probably balk a little bit at the idea of 2,000 different schemes for culture as well, because that will slow things down, and we do not need things to be slowed down. But so I would be advocating for that dialogue, but then a cross-cultural, flexible kind of scheme to be able to make the interventions that dialogue uncovers as being the most critical to having a kind of irreducible core of cultural infrastructure in a very wide sense, human capital and social capital, as well as buildings, still standing as we emerge from this pandemic. And also, I think Nick makes a great point about, if you can use the system and use kind of trusted agents who can help with sector development rather than trying to do it all at the centre, I think that would be a help to getting needs met more quickly as well.
And I was going to then move on from places to talk about people. I think all of you have talked about the fact that some folk have fallen through the gaps between the different support schemes, particularly those who work freelance or part-time or what have you, or move in and out of the sector and combine it with other work. Has the experience we've already come through in the last few months meant that the sector in the broadest sense, not just kind of performers, but that wide range of people contributing skills and experience to the creative and cultural sectors, has the sector already lost a substantial amount of talent that won't come back, or will people who maybe had to leave the sector and try to look for work elsewhere or relying on universal credit, are they going to find it possible to come back into that kind of work in the future? And can there be any positive opportunity that we can turn this into a chance to widen the net, to cast the net wider in future and bring more people with a different range of backgrounds or talents or skills into the cultural and creative sectors in the future as we return or as we seek some sort of recovery? And I know, again, everybody will maybe have a different view, but I'll perhaps ask Alex and Sandy to comment on that.
I'll be honest, it's hard to quantify whether we've lost anybody already. I mean, anecdotally, one almost wants to say yes, but I think because the lockdown thus far has been so universal across society, there's not necessarily been avenues for people to go down. I think as we get on beyond now, as to get things half opening and some sectors opening, I think the next period is possibly the more difficult period, where there's that sense that, for example, theatres can open, but we can't really do anything because it's not financially viable to open. So it's tricky to then employ actors and designers and directors and playwrights to come and put work on in our buildings. And I think that's the challenging period we're entering into. And it's how we sustain through from now to social distancing having gone and being able to gear back up to full capacity. I think that phase brings with it opportunities for how we look to, in Scottish theatre terms, how we look to rejuvenate the Scottish theatre sector that, as I alluded to earlier, had actually been somewhat denuding over the past 10 years. So I think there's an opportunity for us there to really focus on making work in Scotland and focus on getting work out to audiences. I think that's really important to us. And I think holding on to the skills we have will be really key, because it lets us do things quickly and efficiently, because we've got people who are massively talented at operating on very limited resources to make some terrific culture. And I think holding on to those people will be the most efficient way to get the sector back on its feet, rather than having to suddenly go out and re-recruit a whole load of lost people.
And Sandy may also have a perspective on this from the point of view of the wider kind of supply chain, the different kind of organisations that work with the sector but aren't necessarily kind of purely cultural organisations themselves. Are the same challenges facing you and other organisations like you around? Do you seek to retain or later re-recruit?
So a lot of our the people in our the freelancers that we use and myself, we're all passionate about what we do, and other jobs are of little interest. But a lot of the guys the girls and guys we use have gone to drive for Amazon or things like that, which actually gives them a more kind of permanent income than they're used to actually. But it's not what they want to do. So certainly short, medium term, I think we can pull them back into the workplace quite easily. I think the diversification, we've changed what we do. We're doing kind of hybrid meetings a lot for. That's the kind of request at the moment. So we're kind of diversification, and there's training and equipment that needs done for that, but it's keeping some of the freelance guys involved, a lot lower scale and a lot lower income for them, but we're all kind of hands-on and moment quite flexible to diversify into other areas just to keep the hand in. But it is a long-term thing for us really. In a year's time, what's going to happen, and if they're deflated and find other work and just think I'm not going to risk coming out of a safe job, if you like, to going back into what's unknown at the moment, then that's the risk. But I see that being a longer term situation. But yeah, it's about passion for us. So I would like to think we'd see a lot of them coming back in quite quickly.
Thank you. If there's time, Camilla, could I ask if Lucy from Museum Galleries Scotland would be able to comment specifically on the issues in relation to publicly owned or ALIO-run venues and premises and organisations. Is there a different set of challenges and solutions in relation to those organisations?
Well, certainly the challenges that I think, as you rightly pointed out, they've been called upon to generate a lot more of their income as those culture trusts have embedded from when they were first parted from the local authorities, and they've been very successful in doing that. And that, of course, has then created the vulnerability without that income there. That puts them in a difficult position now. And as you've said, some of them are very much cross-subsidised by leisure services that support that. So yes, they need a very specific, I think, piece of support to help them to do that. And I think we're very much at a point of a danger of losing people from the sector. But I don't think we're there yet, and I think that's where it depends on the interventions that come forward and how this money is allocated, I think, as to what that then looks like. But they're all different, and that's one of the challenges, is that some of them include libraries, some of them include sport, and so actually finding the right funding mechanism absolutely is challenging. But I know there's a lot of work going into that at the moment. And you did just to pick up on your point about whether we need more and different people in the sector, and I think we absolutely do. It's something that we've been working hard on through Museums Galleries Scotland, and I think in order to see the most diverse audiences, the more diverse workforce that we can have, the better. That very much plays into that. We're also working on projects at the moment trying to diversify the volunteer workforce. Volunteers play an enormously important role across the culture sector, but not least in museums and galleries. They tend to be from an older profile and therefore have been particularly affected by COVID, and many of them don't feel ready to come back or feel safe to do so. So we're working hard with Volunteer Scotland and others to try and diversify the volunteer base as well, and think of opportunities, and if training and recognised qualifications can come through some of that, that just helps fill in that mix for some younger people as well.
Interesting. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to bring in Annabelle, but before I do, we've got 4 other members who have still to ask questions. So could I ask if we, restrict our questions to those witnesses who it's most pertinent to, and if we could keep questions and answers as succinct as possible. Thanks very much, Annabelle.
Thank you, Convener, and I will try to follow your guidance. And good morning, panel, and thank you very much indeed for coming in. Obviously, we've had a very interesting discussion, but I think it's fair to say it's a fairly gloomy discussion, and I'm not entirely sure that my questions are going to add any particular ray of sunshine, but I do feel it's important. My first question would be to Alec and to Nick, and my second question to Lucy on a slightly different subject. So to Alec and to Nick, Alec made reference to a survey, because my question is on how do we get audiences back? It's the other side of the equation. How do we get them to feel confident in going back at whatever point we reach when that can happen in greater numbers? Alec referred to a survey, and it would be interesting if you could provide a bit more detail for the record. What is the survey? When was the survey carried out? Who was surveyed? But the upshot was, it seems that 50% of potential audiences want to be convinced about social hygiene and so forth, hygiene and social distancing and so forth, and in fact 33% want to wait till the social distancing issue is no longer there. So I just wonder, taking that as the backdrop, what is the cultural sector doing itself to work to convince audiences? Because if that survey is correct and is representative, that is a very, very, very significant hurdle to overcome, irrespective of what funding is made available and other support in the interim to keep things afloat. But at some point we've got to go back to hopefully having people come to participate in the arts. So what is the role for the sector in convincing audiences of safety? So sorry, first to Alec, then it says reference to the survey.
The survey I was referring to is it was undertaken by a consultancy called Indigo, and it was the specific report is called Act 2 National Audience Research. It was based on surveys conducted throughout the month of June, and it was reported on in July. It attracted 62,000 responses from audiences across 232 organisations in the UK. So that's the backdrop for that. I'm not aware that whether or not it's publicly available as a document. If it's helpful, I can check and I can revert to the clerks subsequent to this meeting. If it's useful for the panel if a copy of that's available for distribution, I'm happy to see if I can facilitate that. In terms of what can we do as a sector to convince audiences, I think right now a lot of our work has been on lobbying governments about how to help us reopen. I think when we get to the point at which we can reopen, the messaging we then put in place for what we can offer and how we can do it will be key. But for many of us not thinking in the theatre sector that we can open anything of scale this calendar year, I think convincing audiences is probably a little way off. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the cinema sector. We know that they're looking with high hopes to Christopher Nolan's release of Tenet this week to see if that's going to bring audiences back into cinemas, because as I understand it, cinema figures thus far have not been particularly encouraging. So I think we can look at what other sectors who are opening ahead of us are managing to do with audiences and see how we can apply them. Again, I'm speaking purely of the theatre sector here. It'll be different for galleries and museums, for sure.
Thank you. And Nick, when you're responding, I mean, you've already alluded to it, but obviously we are going to have social distancing with us for some time to come, be it 2 or 1. So for music venues, Nick, how do you see yourself coping within that context in terms of audiences feeling that they wish to come? I mean, I've heard people talk about going to restaurants and they'll make the comment, or B&Bs or hotels, whatever it is, and they'll make the comment they're taking it seriously. So that is the consumer talking. So for the consumer of music, what do you need to say to people?
Well, I've seen very gloomy surveys and I've seen very positive surveys. I think it depends which art form you're surveying. It also matters about the demographics of who's getting surveyed as well. I do understand that Alex's survey was a very particularly large one. Music Venue Trust have got a very interesting survey whose results I don't have to hand, but I would be happy to pass on to the committee at a later stage. The attitude from grassroots music venues has been that we are following public health guidelines. We want to reopen every venue safely. And I think actually that message is the strongest one, because it will say that when we do reopen, we think things will be safe. But from that point of view, we have to follow public health advice. There are operators of nightclubs, etc., who are planning to put their future customers through antibacterial or antiviral spraying tunnels and all sorts of things as well, as if to say that certain things will definitely be safe. And again, strangely, the news this week was exactly that is not safe and that is dangerous. So whilst public health advice is in flux all the time, whilst it's not clear exactly what is and isn't safe, we simply need to wait. And in terms of messaging from us, we will say, we will open when it will be safe. We will do something that is safe. We've got a show on sale at the moment by a well-known band called Ash. It's done as a crowdfunder, and tickets are raffled. So a famous band is going to play for only 100 capacity in Sneaky Pete's, and it's a competition trying to have a chance to win a ticket. That show has specifically been launched saying that the show will only happen when there is no social distancing and when it's absolutely safe to go see the shows. And I can say that from that, people have been very happy to enter that competition. People, I think, want to go see those shows which are absolutely, definitely safe. And Music Venue Trust, at least, is encouraging operators not to do any public messaging that might imply that they know better than the public or public health authorities about what might or might not be a safe way to go see shows. I can understand cinemas, for instance, being bullish. UK Hospitality have been essentially writing their own guidance, etc. And the right to do so, and the right to try and prove that they can trade, but it's really important to know that for public confidence, this stuff has to come from government.
Okay, thank you for that. I mean, there has to be guidance which is as clear as it can be, but equally, each business has to take the bull by the horns thereafter and get your audiences back in whatever way you can. The other question for Lucy, if I may. So I think Lucy had referred to in her opening remarks, or to in response to an earlier question, that work was going on with various museums to help them become more resilient, and it would be useful perhaps if Lucy could give a few examples of the nature of that work. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a whole range of different things that organisations are doing, be it ways of generating additional sources of income. So, for example, the fantastic Gairloch Museum, which reopened last year after refurbishment in a new venue, is working with lots of local creative artists to create a fantastic shop, which they're using to sell locally made things, and artists can rent a space in their shop, and they also have a selling exhibition gallery within that building that they always have local artists with paintings on sale. So things like that, they're just enterprising. And also in that venue they've got a room that they rent to the University of Highlands and Islands as a space where with computers and things that people can come in. So it's things like that, just diversifying a little bit how their spaces are used. It was funded through lottery funding and funding from Museums and Galleries Scotland and others. And so, but by creating multi-use venues, that's a nice example that others can learn from. We're working a lot with museum forums at the moment, so we're bringing geographical groups of museums together to look at whether there's things they can share. And it's kind of early days, but that's a project that we've just got up and running, and we're very much promoting shared activity and giving grants just for partnership activity to try and look at what those opportunities are. I think there's early days again for some of those. There are a number of museums and galleries that are looking at looking for funding to come up with greener solutions to their heating, for example, and reducing their costs through some climate adaptation for those venues, which is clearly in relation to future resilience really important. So yeah, a mixture of cutting costs and of raising funding that needs to come into that, and I think we will be looking at different possibilities of that. There are some services that are looking, for example, local authority services looking to get communities to take on some of their venues. That's a really tricky one in terms of where communities maybe have been up for asset transfers in the past, that maybe would be less confident about doing that now, just looking at a situation like this that leaves them exposed if they were to take on some of those assets. There's a range of different things that are possible for different organisations. And we'll be exploring lots of those and very much sharing the good case studies as they come up, so that if we get a really good example of something, we'll be making sure that we use our knowledge exchange platforms to make sure that those examples are shared more widely, and also to engage with those outside the museums and galleries sector to try and bridge those links to others. We've been working with Highlands and Islands Enterprise as well through the Expo North programme to try and make links between museums and galleries and creative industries to look at some of those opportunities, and I think these are really important for a bit of different thinking about what the possibilities can be if we look beyond our own sort of individual bits of the sector silos.
Thanks, Lisa. A very comprehensive answer. Can I just briefly clarify, though, that online activity is also in the mix? Because online activity, because I would have thought, you're talking about shops, for example, I would have thought an online facility, to the extent that it's possible, depending on the size of the resource of the particular museum, would be the way to go, certainly in the interim period of time, because you might manage to generate some business.
There are probably some opportunities there. The museum's done a huge amount of online activity during lockdown in terms of keeping content visible for visitors and engaging, and they've done some online fundraising. There hasn't been a lot of income generation through that sort of online but it's definitely an opportunity that people will be looking at, and certainly, as you say, the mix that they're going to need in the coming years, that is a possibility we'll be exploring.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We now move to Beatrice Bushard.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel, and thank you all for your very forthright answers. I think it's been very helpful this morning. I would observe that at the moment I'm reading Bleak House for my next book group meeting, and I do feel it's a rather bleak house that we're looking at here. Annabelle's line of questioning there was very helpfully leads on to what I was going to ask about. Diversification and adapting to online services. I'm particularly interested in, I would like to hear from Lucy and Julia about how engagement during this process is able to continue with young people. particularly through schools. Young people have missed so much, so I'm wondering if there are any particular areas that are being focused on young people.
Yeah, the really is activity that's been focused at young people, and I think one of the things that's been really exciting, one of the positives that's come through some of the online activity that museums have created. They were creating lots of fun content for parents, homeschooling, for example, and actually have engaged some new audiences in their activity that perhaps they haven't connected with before, and that's been really, really positive, and clearly is something that we'd be very keen to see continue. There's a great example that just launched this week from the Scottish Maritime Museum that's running a whole programme of new online activity of STEM learning. It's one of our industrial museums, so they've got lots of really nice, exciting, very real examples of how technology has been a key part of our past in that area, and for connecting in with schools on things that are very much relevant to the curriculum and connected into Curriculum for Excellence, and developing those in partnership also with schools, so we get the content right for what they need. It's definitely something that we'll continue to expand, I think.
Thank you. Julia?
Yes, so after lockdown, our spring festivals, including the Science Festival and the Children's Festival, retooled a lot of their material very, very quickly to support that homeschooling effort, and are looking at how they can continue to support a good bank of online material. The book festival, I don't know if people are familiar with the Baillie Gifford schools programme and young people's programme, but they've got very strong presence this summer, and again they are seeing that as part of a hybrid model, which they're not going to move away from in the future. They're going to continue to build on. We've got Storytelling Festival coming up in October, and they have imagined a sort of hybrid event, which hopefully will be resilient to whatever's happening around physical distancing at that time. But importantly, they have made micro grants available to storytellers across the whole of Scotland, so that communities and schools and clubs can request a storytelling event in their community, and then their network of storytellers would fulfil that. So I think digital is an essential part of the future, but I don't think it can replace live. I think having those reasons to come together, and having the sense of there being a moment where if you're not in the moment, you miss it, is part of the human experience, is part of the learning experience, and it's really important that we continue to bring these things together as we adapt and innovate.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. We certainly do need to keep things in the moment in terms of the creative industries. Could I just ask one quick question, maybe aim it to Nick, please, about actual digital connectivity? Has it been an issue in terms of musicians and performances? I mean, I think we've all seen live performances, and musicians have given generously, not charging for some of their performances. Do you know if there has been an issue, Nick, in terms of connectivity?
I'm not quite sure what you would describe as an issue being, if there are technical problems with musicians doing it or not.
Yeah, sorry, I mean technical problems.
Yeah, so one reason why live music streams have been so hard to sell is because the quality across the board has been so poor. It does kind of reinforce the point that it's great to get back to live. But where there could be funding to do better production for digital stuff, and that went to musicians and that went to technicians, I think that could be fantastic. It won't save venues, and our experience so far is that venues have really struggled to fundraise at all, if they've even tried from their live shows, to get any money that's going to sustain the venues themselves. But I think that for some musicians, they've made really great work of turning that into part of their key income, and I'm glad about that.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. We have been given a little bit of extra time by broadcasting, so if our witnesses can stay with us for a little bit longer, we really appreciate your time today. Great. We'll now move to Oliver Mundale.
Thank you, Convener. I wanted to ask the panellists about their outreach work I think particularly for the citizens' theatre and festivals and maybe museums, but I'm happy to stick with the first two timing-wise. Obviously, people are fighting for survival and saving jobs, and just finding a way to keep the doors open takes precedence. But obviously, there's really important work you do to reach disadvantaged young people, to diversify those who are interested in theatre and culture. I just wondered how you saw that work moving forward in the months ahead. Maybe for Alex or Julia.
Thanks, Oliver. In terms of our outreach work, much of it was initially suspended during lockdown. We, over the summer when the school holiday started, we normally run a 2-week summer academy program for young people. What our learning department brilliantly did is retool that to be delivered online through Zoom and other platforms. So we ran that over the summer, and that we learned a lot from doing that. It's the first time we've done it, and it was pretty well subscribed. So I think we had over 74, 75 people taking part in that online. Right now, we're planning the online delivery of a lot of our normal activities with community groups, with disadvantaged groups, with specific people that we have a regular relationship with, and to deliver those programs online. The first instance, we reckon, probably up until about October, November time, and we'll continue to review that in line with government and health authority guidance about when we might be able to start having them in person rather than online. It's also important to recognise that digital poverty is an issue for a number of the groups we work with. So what some of our team have been doing is actually going out into the community in a socially distanced way, standing at the end of people's paths, standing outside their windows, and coming up with things that we can deliver that's in the spirit of what we do for people who can't access us digitally. And we're going to look to how we can continue to do that. And the money we've received to the Performing Venue Relief Fund, part of that will go towards delivery of some of our outreach work in the months ahead, in the event that we need to hire bigger spaces to have more social distancing available to us. So we very much plan to keep delivering a lot of that work.
Yes, thanks very much, Alex. That's fascinating, and many of those techniques are techniques that the festivals and their participants have been using as well. Last season in 2019, we did a survey of the links that we had with community groups, and it was 130. So we're really keen, as we come back, to make sure that we can sustain and deepen as much of those relationships as possible for community resilience. But we were just having a conversation between the community and schools engagement workers across the festivals the other day, and obviously one of the things that's happened is that many of the community groups we work with have kind of turned themselves into first responders, or food banks at the moment. So we have to think really carefully and really laterally and really creatively about how we can support them and engage with them, because it's not necessarily going to be possible for them at the moment to have the same kind of experience with creatives as they did have. And yet they're also telling us that they see that access to culture as a really important part of people's mental health and resilience, of course, coming back. So an example of how we have been retooling some of that community work into online is where the Fringe runs a very extensive Fringe Days Out programme, which is making sure that people who are living in less advantaged areas of the city are feeling that connection to the festivals that happen in their city and feeling that they are invited and they are part of it. And a theatre maker who usually works with street theatre, and who's been doing a project with Youth Theatre Scotland for the last 6 months, Melanie Jordan, has been asked to work with one of the communities in Edinburgh to take the techniques that she learnt doing that project as an online project into connecting communities across the city with the Fringe. So the work continues, but it's being reinvented at pace.
Thank you very much. As a second question, really for Julia, some of the festivals you've mentioned, I don't kind of want to pick individual people out, and there's understandable reasons why it's the case, but they've already started slimming their staff teams down, and I know that some festivals moving forward are working with a very small team, and it's just what support you're going to give to the individuals who are still in employment, because I think there's a concern, certainly anecdotally, that people will be asked to do more for even less financial return in what's already in some cases quite a low paid industry where people are doing things for the love of it, and it's just what support is going to be given to employees who are going to have a very tough year ahead.
The festivals have all been looking, obviously, at how they can retain a kind of core of staff that will allow them to grow again when conditions permit. And for one or two of them, that does mean, because they've had very difficult times with some of the funding that they were due to have coming in, not now being available to them, whether that was commercial revenue or sponsors or international projects and contracts, for example. They have been in a situation where they know that unless they moved on slimming down to a smaller core team, they would not be viable for the rest of the year. And also we share some of the issues with many other cultural organisations that have been described this morning around trading arms and the amount of revenue that's now self-generated. So where those core teams have now been put in place at a smaller level, there obviously has to be very clear communication among the group about what the priorities are and how people are going to be able to specialise, so that we're not beyond the carrying capacity of the organisation. I think what people are doing very successfully is upskilling and reskilling workforce and contractors and freelancers who work with the festivals. So again, back to the book festival, this summer it's an entirely digital offering. That's been a real, people have had to dig deep in order to be able to innovate and turn their physical offering into a digital offering over a small number of months. But they've done so very largely with the team that's in place and with the contractors that's in place who've been able to go with them in terms of learning new skills that will be very marketable and resilient for the future. So we very much hope that with an open dialogue with our teams, we can go forward in a way that's going to be sustainable and viable, but also future facing and giving people skills that will be able to take them into the future jobs market.
Thank you, Kavita.
Thank you very much. And now we'll move to Kenneth Gibson, who's the last member to ask questions.
Thank you, Kavita. A lot of questions I'd like to ask, but obviously I'll keep it brief given time constraints. And first question I'd like to ask is to Julia. In her submission, she talked about the huge loss of some £360 million to the wider economy, and indeed 7,000 jobs from the collapse of the 2020 season across hospitality, tourism, creative and retail sectors, and has obviously expressed concerns about long-term viability. And then she goes on to talk about the global position of Scotland, especially at a time when we're going to be, the UK is going to be leaving Europe. I'm just wondering, I think there's a real issue about the immediate crisis, but how concerned with the global situation long term is the festival? Because as we know, in previous years, people who come from overseas often book hotels in Edinburgh months or even a year in advance, book their tickets months in advance. But now with quarantines and bikes and all the rest of it, there's a real issue, I believe, about cash flow, with people thinking, well, do you know what, I might wait until July just to see if the festival is going to actually happen, or I'm not going to be quarantined, etc. So I'm just wondering how the festival, Julia, is planning for these long-term issues which you could be facing.
You're absolutely right. I think decision making is becoming much shorter term, and that obviously poses a difficulty for the whole system. And we are part of a group in Edinburgh which is looking at economic recovery and the visitor economy as part of that. And obviously at the moment there's a campaign going on called Forever Edinburgh, which is initially about encouraging residents to rediscover their city and its amenities, and will be radiating out from there to look at short distance visitors and then the domestic market across the UK. I know that Mark Crothall from STA gave evidence to me yesterday and was saying that the international market remains very important for the health of the Scottish tourism industry. So we do need to all come together and look at as much of the trend data and the international examples as we can to see how we can come back as an attractive tourist destination, continuing to have those reasons to visit, like the festivals. I think will be a key part of that. At the same time, obviously, we're very conscious that the world of travel was set to change very radically as a result of the deeper kind of crisis of climate change in the longer term. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there were structural changes in the visitor market to make that much more about short haul in the future. And we certainly are looking at how we can, on the performers front, how we can have international cultural exchange without too much intense global mobility, because when you think about orchestras, for example, who are booked up 5 years ahead and who are travelling around the world in their hundreds, I don't think that's coming back anytime soon. So there absolutely is a very urgent need to find out where those loyal, curious, responsible visitors are that are going to be the future lifeblood of our sector. But there is also an opportunity to reinvent the sector as well.
Okay, thank you for that. And Alex, the Citizens Theatre, I have to say, very, very fond memories for me. I used to go when I was at school, just to virtually every different production that you had for many, many years then and thereafter. So obviously it's quite an emotional venue for me, and I'm sure for many thousands of others who grew up with the Citizens Theatre. Now, in terms of the long-term future of the Cits, we've already touched on your survey. 93% of people are missing attending live events, but only 19% would consider returning just because of the reopen, and 3/4 are looking for some form of social distancing, and yet you need 70% attendances to break even at the Cits. So I'm just wondering, are you looking for the Scottish Government and Glasgow City Council and others to perhaps produce a 5-year plan for the future of the Citizens Theatre? Because I don't think things are going to go back to normal next year or possibly the year after. And if we're looking at long-term viability, particularly given the huge investment going into the Cits with its redevelopment, what are you looking for long-term to ensure not just survival, but that the Citizens Theatre thrives for the years and decades to come?
I think perversely we're in a slightly fortunate position in the midst of this pandemic, in that we're in exile. We're not running our building year-round and doing a full programme of work. It's unlikely the redevelopment will be finished before probably spring 2022. So therefore it's probably autumn 2022 before we're trying to mount full seasons of work back in our theatre, back in our home. I would hope by then social distancing is a distant memory, and the world is starting to feel a lot more normal again. And under those circumstances, I feel far more confident about throwing the doors of the theatre open. In terms of a longer-term plan, I think it's up to us to come up with that plan. It's not up to the government or local authorities to come up with a 5-year plan for the Cits. In order to help us come up with that 5-year plan, what I really need is longer-term funding commitments. We've been lobbying for that before with local authorities and with Scotland. 3-year funding isn't long enough to plan on for businesses of our scale, and that would apply to numerous theatres around Scotland. I think longer-term strategic funding plans really helps us to plan to build our audiences and diversify our audiences and what happens in our building. That would help.
Yeah, and I think that last part, diversifying audience, is important, because whenever I go to theatre or did the opera, I note that most people are actually older than me, actually, and I'm no spring chicken. So with the loss of outreach groups to schools, etc., how are you going to try and encourage younger people, into the theatre, so it becomes the kind of habit of the time that I got to when I used to go for 50p at the sits, when I was at school?
We still do the 50p tickets, and will when we're back. Having accessible pricing is always part of what we do. It's about programming. I can't speak for what operas or shows you've been to see and the audience that's been around you, but I think depending on what you go and see, you will see vastly different audiences in the theatre. I know if you put a piece like Train Spotting, or there's been shows like Barbershop Chronicles that have been touring around the UK, and things like that, drawing massive diverse audiences. I think a lot of it is in the hands of what we choose to put on stage. It's not all about what we choose to charge for it. I think programming is a key part, and therefore involving more types of artists and more artist voices in the work that goes on our stages has a big role to play in who comes into the theatres as well. And that's
I think that's a good point.
For the building was part of the whole rationale for redeveloping the theatre. Was to make it better able to diversify who it represents and who it can support.
Yeah, I do recall when seeing The Wizard of Oz, the audience was slightly younger than when I saw Hedda Gabler. In fact, it's so thank you very much. Thank you, Gavina.
Thanks very much for that. And I remember going to the sits for nothing when you gave tickets away free if you were unwaged, like a student. So I was there every week as well. So very much wish you well. Before we wind up, I just wanted to ask a couple of points of clarification. It was particularly Nick and Alex with regards to £70 million of consequentials. Nick had said that Creative Industries had told him it was allocated. Nick, who are you referring to when you talk about Creative Industries? Are you talking about a civil servant in the Scottish Government, or are you talking about a branch of Scottish Enterprise?
Oh, sorry. Most specifically, and I don't mean to be here to dob anyone in, because I understand that meetings that we have, importantly, aren't public meetings. But we have weekly meetings with Simon Cuthbert-Kerr, who's the head of Creative Industries, working under Fiona Hislop. And right. That was the impression that he repeatedly gave us.
Right. And thanks very much for that clarification. And Alex, you seemed very, very convinced that the 97 had been allocated. Why were you so convinced of that yourself?
Similar to Nick, it's not in the interest of dobbing anybody in, as Nick put it. I had been inquiring about whether any of that 97 million consequential would be available for capital projects, because we're in the middle of one and there's going to be impacts that will need additional funding for the SITs. And in a forum that featured all the public funding stakeholders for our project, it was said that none of the 97 million would be available for capital, and indeed it had all already been allocated to resources.
Yeah. Okay, thanks very much for that. Although there are rules around consequentials, and I know that the government has asked to, if they can put money that was allocated for capital into revenue, and that's something that the UK government have so far, as I understand it, not done, but we'll continue to keep an eye on that, and indeed keep an eye on what you've told us about the allocation of the 97 million. That's very interesting. I think the committee will want to follow up on that. So thank you very much to all our witnesses today. It's been a long shift and it can be hard sitting in one place, but we've really benefited from you sharing your experience and knowledge with us today. So thank you very much. And we shall now move into private session and close the broadcast part of the meeting. Thank you very much.